Hello, welcome to our presentation at AECT in 2020. My name is Rick West. I'm a professor at Brigham Young University, and along with my colleagues from the University of Memphis, this session is about guardrails to constructing learning, the potential for open microcredentials to support inquiry-based learning. This is based on a paper that we've recently had published in Tech Trends, and we're going to begin by having Andrew Tawfik explain a little bit about inquiry-based learning and some of the challenges with IBL that we think lend themselves to opportunities that microcredentials can help solve.
Recently, within the education community, there's been an emphasis on inquiry-based learning. And at the heart of inquiry-based learning are ill-structured problems. And so if you contrast this with the didactic, lecture-based approaches to education, which is devoid of context, inquiry-based learning says, ask students to take an active role as part of the problem-solving process. And as an extension of that, ask them to solve authentic cases. And so at the root of that are ill-structured problems. These problems have different perspectives about how to solve the problem. These problems have different evidence that could support different solutions. And so really you're focused on the viability of the solution, given all the constraints, all the different perspectives, how dynamic the problem is at its core. And when people talk about the inquiry-based learning compared with the lecture-based approach, they point to a couple different things as being more advantageous from a learning perspective. So these problems lack clear solutions or parameters for solving the case. These are authentic and represent what practitioners deal with in the quote-unquote real world. In addition, because there's no really one right way to solve the problem, learners need to engage in argumentation. They need to put forth what their idea is, consider the alternative perspective, be able to reflect afterwards and think about what my solution is, and be able to justify that in light of potentially contrasting evidence. As part of it, because the case itself is ill-defined, the variables may be latent, I need to be able to ask meaningful questions and be able to ask them across the problem-solving perspective. With each iteration, I potentially ask a new question. And at the end, I need to be able to solve the problem. And that requires decision-making and again, justification for that decision. But at the same time, as much as theorists point to potential opportunities from a problem-solving perspective, there are also real challenges. And Hung articulated this in 2011 when he talked about the theory to practice challenge. And other studies have supported this. One of the things that people point to is this issue of self-directed learning. So again, the viability of the problem is equally as important to the reasoning process, the evidence presented in other areas. So students need to self-direct their learning. They may follow one path, but their peer, across from them might look at another path. And they're approaching this in a self-directed learning process, but they're going down different directions. How does an instructor facilitate these different processes? And so one of the things that we'll argue and talk a little bit about is microcredentials can be used to establish the necessary background knowledge and pathways. If one learner progresses down one path and another learner down an additional path, the microcredentials can provide them kind of scaffolding or potential ways of bridging them along that process. Another one, especially that's really been talked about in recent years, is this issue of assessments. If you have an ill-structured problem where there's no one right way to solve the problem, how do I, as an instructor, assess all these different solutions? And so it's inefficient. Some argue that it's impractical. When I'm looking at something like a concept map, how do I provide a grade or feedback to this particular student? The same is true for argumentation. And again, going back to the practicality of it, students, especially for ill-structured problems, they need timely feedback. They need to be here on a regular basis. This is what you've done right. Alternatively, you need a different justification for this. You need to provide other evidence. And if I don't have that, and if I only receive it at the end of the day, at the end of my problem solving, there's questionable about how really beneficial the problem solving actually it is. So how can, if teachers are dealing with these things where there's different ways of self-directing their learning, there's different solutions that are being developed, and then I need to provide timely feedback on top of that for these different solutions, it becomes very unwieldy very quickly. And so what we'll talk about are how micro-credentials can afford unique opportunities for assessment because of their flexibility, whether that be the criteria, evidence, and even for the ability to claim rather than receive credit. So it's not just me as the instructor saying, this is what you need to achieve to. What if we ask students to be in the driver's seat and say, what do you think are relevant criteria for solving the problem? How would you rate yourself, maybe rate your peers? And we'll expound on these points here in a little bit.
Andrew. So Andrew introduced a little bit about inquiry-based learning and what some of the challenges are that we face with trying to implement this student-centered method. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about what open microcredentials are, or as they're sometimes called, open badges. And then we'll conclude with a few ideas and a few examples of how microcredentials might help meet this need that we have with inquiry-based learning. But first, what are open microcredentials? Some of you know this, but in case you didn't, open microcredentials are a new credential technology that has several different affordances and characteristics. First, it's micro, so it's focused on smaller bits of learning and skill, focused on specific skills and knowledge rather than giving you a credential at the end of, say, a 4-year program. Second, because it's built on open technology, it's able to be shared across institutions. So one institution could issue a credential and the other institution could read that credential and add it to, say, a trajectory of learning or a pathway of learning that they have at their institution. Third, they're shareable because it's digital. It's shareable on online portfolios, social media, and things like that on the internet. Fourth, because it's digital, you can pack as much data into this little credential as you can think to do. So for example, on this next slide, I show some examples of the kinds of data that you could pack inside one of these open credentials, such as the name of the credential, what you had to do to earn this credential, who gave it to you, who earned it, what kinds of standards this skill or this knowledge is attached to. If it's part of a 21st century skill set, for example, identified maybe by the federal government or by the Europe credentialing agencies. So you can attach it to standards. You can say when the credential was given, when it expires, if it has a shelf life, who endorses this credential, what version of this credential you earned. And that's that fourth one from the bottom, the evidence link. That to me is the most important piece of data that you can put inside this credential, which is the actual evidence that you have that knowledge and skill. So no longer is what you did detached from your credential. Instead, they're integrated. And what you did is there inside of the credential saying you did it, which I think is kind of significant. This creates new opportunities for learning ecosystems where you could earn credentials from academic institutions, and I think that will always be true, but you could also earn credentials from professional certifications and professional development organizations, on-the-job training such as IBM, other organizations that provide micro-credentials to their employees, through volunteer work or in community. And inquiry-based learning oftentimes happens in community kinds of situations. So you could earn credentials from all of these different places. They go inside your digital backpack, which is a collection of all your credentials. And then you as the learner control these credentials. And you get to decide how to share them out to qualify for some new pathway that maybe there's a prerequisite that you have to get before you can start on a new pathway of learning. And you can use your badges as keys to unlock these pathways. Or you can share them out on social media to get some notice among your social network, use them to apply for job opportunities, or use them to spiff up your e-portfolio and provide greater evidence for the things that you put on your e-portfolio. One of the unique things that you can do with micro-credentials is create pathways, or sometimes they're called playlists, of skills or learning. So for example, you might have a career that you want to get, and for that career need a certain type of credential to qualify for that career. And that credential could be broken up into smaller micro-credentials. It says, well, first you need to have this knowledge and this knowledge and this knowledge. And then you need to learn skill A, skill B, and skill C. And if you do all those skills and get all those pieces of knowledge, then you qualify for the larger credential, which opens up this career for you. So it can create this pathway that leads people bit by bit towards the career that they want. Well, is this happening? Is anybody using these micro credentials? IMS Global, who creates the open standard for this technology, has determined that there's been 43 million of these badges issued by 2020. So yes, around the world, lots of people issuing and earning micro credentials. The US Department of Education even has said that this has the potential to revolutionize education. And the question we have that started us on this collaboration was thinking, what about inquiry-based learning? Could open badges revolutionize inquiry-based learning by addressing the two challenges that Andrew mentioned? Number one, the challenge of how do we support the self-directed learning, the messy self-directed learning? And two, how do we scaffold and provide assessment and feedback to students along the way as they move on their paths towards solving their inquiries? So I want to just share a few ideas and a few examples and cases that are in our paper of how this can be done. Number one, mapping prerequisite knowledge. So part of the idea with inquiry-based learning is that students are self-directed and the whole project is student-centered. But what if the student isn't ready to do the inquiry? How do you get them ready? How do you help some students that aren't quite as far along as other students get up to speed so that they can all engage in this inquiry process? So the nice thing about microcredentials is you can use them to create these playlists where you are very explicit about what skills and knowledge sets are needed to qualify for other opportunities. This example comes from Purdue's Instructional Design and Technology program, and they have classes that are inquiry and project-based classes where they list prerequisite skills that you must have before engaging in the project process and the inquiry process. And you can earn these on your own. You can take a workshop perhaps. At least in my university, when we did a similar type of idea, we offered workshops for people that if they wanted in-person learning, or they could do it on their own. But either way, they needed to develop these prerequisite knowledge sets before engaging in the project and inquiry process. So that's one way that badges could help, is by mapping what these prerequisite knowledge sets are and providing some scaffolding for people in earning and learning these prerequisite knowledge sets. Number two, microcredentials can allow for flexible criteria and evidence in the assessment process. So this comes from the Utah Microcredentials group, which I'm a part of. I'm on their advisory board here in the state of Utah. We're developing microcredentials to support teacher professional development, teacher learning. The entire teacher in-service learning system is moving towards microcredentials in the state of Utah. And here you have a microcredential that a teacher perhaps wants to earn. And the criteria is down below for what they have to do to earn this microcredential. But what evidence they submit to show the reviewer that they've earned this criteria and that they've met these criteria, those choices are made by the learner. The learner, the teacher, gets to decide what evidence will qualify them. So they can submit a video, they can submit student work, they can submit a lesson plan, they can submit a testimonial from a supervisor perhaps, or some other piece of evidence that they think will show the reviewer that they've met the criteria. And so this empowers the learner in student-centered learning to think of their own learning path and create the evidence that will meet the criteria that the teacher has set out, but be flexible enough to allow for different people on different kinds of paths to have different ways of showing that they've got a knowledge or a skill set. Once again, like I mentioned, these microcredentials can be organized into pathways. Here was an example that we had from 2013 from our project-oriented course, where we had lots of different options for students. We had 40 different badges that students could use to create their own personal pathways towards developing competency in educational technology. So an English teacher might choose a different path than a science teacher and might do different projects and do different kinds of things than the science teacher or the English teacher. And all of that was very student-centered. So the students got to decide what projects to work on, what things mattered to them, what things were important to their trajectory and their careers. And we just provided the different pathways that kind of guided them, so that if they said, I want to do a multimedia pathway, we could guide them in the different projects that would help them develop those competencies. Finally, there's a group in Europe, well, worldwide, but particularly based in Europe, called the Open Recognition Alliance. And this group is looking at microcredentials in a very different way. So rather than looking at it in the traditional credential way, where a certified authority issues credentials to the learner, in this case, they're looking at a different trust network where the learners claim the credentials that they think they deserve. And then we trust those learners that they really met those criteria. The teachers, the designers lay out what the criteria are, but then the learners get to claim those credentials when they feel like they're ready. Now, this maybe causes some questions for many of us about how do we know that the learner, how can we trust the learners to be able to make this determination? But remember that everything is transparent. So because all the data is there inside the credential, if there are questions, those questions can be looked at later on by assessing the evidence associated with the person's credential, and maybe asking them to add more evidence to their credential if it's insufficient. But this idea of letting learners claim their credentials might free up this burden in inquiry-based learning of having to always tell the learner when they're ready to begin in inquiry learning. In this case, you can lay out the criteria, provide scaffolding, provide instruction, but the learner claims those credentials and moves on to the inquiry process when they feel like they're ready for it. Now, these ideas are new. They're mostly not tested. There's some evidence, some examples, some cases like we showed you. But mostly what this paper was a conversation starter, an opportunity for us to lay out some theoretical ideas, some conceptual ideas for how microcredentials might support inquiry-based learning, and an invitation for us as a community to put these ideas into practice, collect data, study them out, and see whether this can open the door to inquiry-based learning and make inquiry-based learning more attainable for more teachers and more learners by providing some guardrails. So even though it's still student-centered and inquiry-based, providing some scaffolding and some borders and some guardrails that support the learner down a pathway that we think is beneficial as they move towards completing their inquiries. We'd love to hear your ideas. Come to our session, engage in us in a conversation, and ask us your questions, and we'll ask you ours, and we'll talk about together whether this potential could be something exciting for the field of instructional design.